2 cases of the newly identified variant of coronavirus have now been identified here in the United Kingdom. The variant, named Omicron, poses an increased reinfection risk. The Health Secretary has been talking to reporters about this in the last few minutes.
Yep, that's me, Sajid Javid, Secretary of State for Health and Social Care of the United Kingdom. You're probably wondering how I got here. Well, as a younger man, I took a job at Chase Bank, selling, or should I say overselling, Mexican bonds to suckers in the US, like for example, those naive pension funds. And I was so good at screwing them over that I was eventually headhunted by Deutsche Bank, who got me into a whole new scam called CDOs. You know, those dodgy derivatives that played a major part in the financial crash of 2008. But don't worry, I didn't stick around, as I realized my talents would best be served in politics. And after just 9 years as a Tory MP, I found myself Chancellor of the Exchequer. Yes, that's right, Mr. Moneybags himself. But then, a younger, better looking, more personable, more wealthy, and more Asian looking man than myself came along and took the job. And so I was cast out into the wilderness. Until one day, the Secretary for Health was caught necking a work colleague by a security camera that was in his office for no reason. And this single event somehow caused the previously incredibly experienced health secretary to suddenly and inexplicably forget all the precious health knowledge he'd garnered over the years, and so he was no longer qualified for the job. At the same time, it was discovered that I had inexplicably become a health expert overnight, and so naturally I was given the job. You couldn't make it up.
Just want to say at this point, Complaints on a Plate, this channel, like, comment, subscribe, is a comedy channel. I'm just making some jokes. It's observational comedy. I just think it's funny that someone who worked in the very market that was key to causing the financial crash then went on to work for a government that decided not to punish those banks, but instead punish its own public. I have no idea what Sajid Javid did in Mexico, but I'm sure it was very ethical. I'm also very confident that the CDOs he sold were nothing like the toxic subprime mortgage-riddled CDOs that everyone else was selling at the time. Equally, there's not a doubt in my mind that this city trader cum health secretary only has the best intentions when it comes to the NHS.
So many people, it seems, are under the impression that the NHS is on its way to being privatised. Many NHS doctors and nurses have got themselves so worked up over the idea that they've even set up a Keep Our NHS Public campaign with its own website and everything. They're really putting their heart and soul into it. And that's weird, right? Because most people would quite rightly conclude that any government that decided to privatise the NHS would be hit by such a wave of opposition that they'd be immediately kicked out of power, right? Everyone loves the NHS, and everyone wants to keep the NHS, so what's all the worry about? Though it's true that privatising the NHS will never be an overt policy goal of any political party, scrap-free healthcare won't be a slogan you'll see anybody in their right mind running on. The problem is that just because nobody wants something to happen doesn't mean that it won't. As you might have noticed when it comes to climate change, just because everybody wants something to happen doesn't mean it will either. Because what tends to happen, or not happen as the case may be, is dictated by an economic and political reality that certain policy positions coming out of certain ideological positions that accede to certain economic forces bring about. Get what I'm saying? No? Okay. For example, do you remember when the government passed a bunch of laws that allowed every different type of career path, everything from being a builder to being an academic, to be absorbed into the 0-hour contract gig economy, where everyone is self-employed and no one gets a pension or holidays or sick pay or anything? Do you remember when they brought that in? Do you remember any discussions or campaigning on the issue? No? Well, nor do I, because there wasn't any, right? What happens is that we just kind of gradually fall into these ways of working, fall into these situations, almost as if it were just the natural progression of things, almost as if it's nothing to do with government policy, almost as if it's inevitable. In many ways, the NHS has already been privatised. Over the last 40 years, the government has shifted from directly owning and running health services to buying services from private healthcare providers. Nowadays, it's more accurate to say we have a subsidised healthcare system rather than a nationalised one. And you might say, so what? I don't care. I don't care about funding models, internal markets, trusts or whatever. What makes the NHS is that it's free at the point of use. And that's something the government would never dare mess with. Well, the NHS has been struggling for decades. Long before COVID, it was already plagued by long waiting lists and bed shortages, and so more and more people, who can afford it, have naturally already decided to go private. Many companies now offer private healthcare as part of their employment contract, and so, with less people using the NHS, there is already less interest in maintaining its funding. By hollowing out the NHS's own infrastructure and staff, by turning it into a shell with no resources of its own, the service basically becomes a welfare program. Instead of being a publicly owned, state-run healthcare provider, it becomes a program through which we are given free access to private healthcare by a benevolent state. For users of the NHS, this change, at least at first, doesn't seem particularly concerning. You still have free access to healthcare. However, what's changed is that NHS patients are now competing directly with private patients in privately run healthcare systems. Who do you think will be prioritised? And under this model, there is now two conflicting ways to receive a better service. One is the old way of demanding more funding to the NHS, but the other, far easier, if you can afford it way, is directly buying the service yourself, i.e. go private. It's like food stamps or free school meals. Many people receive free food at the point of use in this country, but no one would argue we have a nationalised food system in the UK. We have a two-tiered system. 1, you pay for it yourself, you get what you want. 2, you get what you're given. But why is this happening? Nobody wants this, right? Right? Private healthcare companies, like any company, will use every means possible to expand their business. This includes, of course, trying to influence government policy. The Conservative Party, which has very small membership and is reliant on big donors, is therefore under tremendous pressure from healthcare companies around the world, particularly the US, to use policy to steer the UK away from free healthcare and towards privatised. Also, ideologically, the Tory party believe a competitive marketplace is the best way to run any service. But it's hard to take Tories seriously on this issue because other than competitiveness, one of the distinguishing features of a private company is that it has a board of directors and shareholders. And Tories tend to be the sort of people who are on boards and hold shares. So the NHS is problematic for the Tories, not only because it severely curtails the growth of private healthcare in the UK, but also because 1 million people working tirelessly and cost effectively as part of a not-for-profit organisation serves as a beacon of light to those who argue that other services, like utilities and railways, could also be nationalised. Already in this country, the government appoints ex-private healthcare professionals to run the NHS. For example, the former NHS chief, Simon Stevens, was, before he worked for the NHS, president of global expansion at United Health, America's largest private healthcare insurer. So his job was to find ways of expanding United Health globally, looking for new markets for United Health. And then his next job was chief of the NHS. Similarly, why would a former banker want to be health secretary? Surely a doctor who had formerly worked for the NHS, or perhaps someone from a nursing union, someone who has a background in health, would be a good choice as health secretary?
The protections that we have, especially the vaccines, are hugely important.
Now that we have 2 cases, what discussions are...
Don't forget the training. Just narrow your eyes and vigorously nod your head as if you're really listening and loving the question.
Into Christmas, how does this change things?
But we mustn't get mad at Sajid Javid, because he's just one of those guys. He's one of those money guys. Yeah, there's lots of them around. They're not ideal, but they're fairly harmless if you keep them occupied. I mean, he's just a guy in the world with dreams like anyone else, and he has the right to try and achieve those dreams, however ridiculous they are. Javid is like a child with his hand in the cookie jar. If you let him, he'll eat all the cookies in the jar, and that will not only upset his little tum-tums, but will also mean that there are no cookies for him tomorrow, or any cookies for anyone else. What we need to do as a society is put the cookie jar up very high where Javid can't get it. Or even better, fill the jar with vegetables so people like Javid have no interest in reaching for the jar. Basically what I'm saying is, it's a systemic problem. It's an incentive problem. The people at the top of the Tory party are not terrible people, they're just terrible people to be running this country. You would think that if anything could stop the slow erosion of the NHS, it would be a pandemic, right? Because in that situation, all eyes are on the government's interaction with the health sector. And the sickness of others increases the likelihood of one's own sickness. You would think that the need for vaccines and tests being available to anyone at any time, despite their financial situation, would put pay to any idea that privatised healthcare is a more effective system. You would think that, wouldn't you? Unless you'd had the unfortunate experience of actually witnessing one, as, well, we all have. So in the 2019 general election, Boris Johnson promised 40 new hospitals for the British people. And this was, of course, before there was even talk of a pandemic coming. Now, no one who knows anything about Boris Johnson, or anything about the Conservative Party, or anything about UK politics or life in the 21st century, believed that 40 hospitals were going to be built.
Jesus Christ, that's the police. Okay. I'll do the talking. I'll do the talking. I'll do the talking, all right? You leave it to me. I've been here before.
But some, I imagine, at least thought what Johnson was trying to say, in his simple-minded way, was that the government understood that the NHS was in need of substantial investment. And yet, fast forward 2 years and throw in a generation-defining, life-altering pandemic in which billions and billions of pounds have been spent under the pretext of fighting the virus. Has there been any investment in the NHS? Well, the short answer is no. There have been temporary cash injections here and there to prop up the system, but this has been very basic stuff, like, for example, purchasing enough PPE so that nurses didn't have to walk around in bin bags. And even most of that money was actually outsourced to private companies. There was also, of course, Hancock's bizarre fly-by-night aircraft hangar COVID wards, hardly a long-term solution. And yes, maybe a year and a half ago, there was little time for much else. But that was then, and this, unfortunately, is now. In fact, other than the furlough scheme, the largest amount of money spent during the pandemic has been on the track and trace system, which was budgeted at £37 billion for the first 2 years. Now, we often talk about taxpayer money disappearing down the drain, but usually this is in the millions, and is small change by government spending standards. But £37 billion is, well, it's only 10 billion short of the entire annual defence budget. £37 billion is basically enough money to have its own government department and minister. And yet, unlike far cheaper track and trace systems set up in other countries, the UK system has been a complete failure, having had almost no effect on the spread of the virus. And on top of this, like just about all other pandemic spending, the system has produced no long-term infrastructure or trained staff. It's essentially been a black hole of public money that has produced little more than a few low-paid temporary contract gig workers, which once the system is disbanded, will disappear without a trace. One of the key problems with the pandemic from the get-go has been the capacity of NHS hospitals. In a normal year, a non-pandemic year sees a shortage of beds and long waiting lines at A&E simply because of a bad flu outbreak. So it's no surprise that the pandemic has seen the NHS teetering on the brink of collapse. Now, of course, no one could have predicted the pandemic. Well, apart from, of course, the people whose job it is to predict threats like pandemics. They predicted one. But whatever. The country was taken by surprise in March 2020. But 2 years on, we could at this point be in the process of, say, off the top of my head, building some new hospitals, or at least some new wards, or even just training new staff. Expanding the capacity of the NHS would not only lessen the need for lockdowns and vastly improve the quality of treatment for those unlucky enough to be admitted at the peak of any coronavirus wave, but also vastly improve the treatment of those suffering from any illness at any time ever. And so even if the virus miraculously disappeared overnight, the money wouldn't have been wasted, because you would be left with a much more robust health system that could easily manage yearly flu outbreaks and give better care to all patients. Sounds pretty good, doesn't it? And far better than what our actual pandemic legacy looks like it will be, which is just a bunch of bored Serco employees hanging shiftlessly around some tents in a Tesco car park. Another thing they could have spent the money on is investing in ventilation in schools, or even building more schools so we can shrink class sizes. This would also just be money well spent regardless of the pandemic. So why hasn't the government invested in the NHS? Why hasn't the government done anything that would be remotely considered long term? Well, to improve the state sector would cut into private profits, now and in the future. And as I've said, the government is under enormous pressure from healthcare providers to not do this, as well, as I said, being ideologically opposed to state-run infrastructure. Also, let's talk about what we can't talk about. That's right, I'm gonna say it. They can't stop me. Let's talk about vac.
Hi there. I want to talk to you about ducts.
Here's a random segment about the Brexit referendum that has nothing to do with the rest of this video. Welcome to Remembrance, with me, your host, Barry Norton.
So if you remember, before, during and after the Brexit referendum, the UK was polarised into pro-EU and anti-EU camps. And despite the EU, and immigration in particular, being incredibly complicated issues, you were either pro-EU, pro-immigration, or anti-EU and racist. And any attempt to sympathise with the other team, or even engage in a debate, was seen by your own side as a betrayal. Because, despite millions of people voting for Brexit for all sorts of reasons, there was much chauvinism, a fair bit of xenophobia, and even a sprinkling of some very, very nasty racism on the anti-EU side. And so, everyone on the anti-EU side was tarnished as a racist, or at least a racist apologist, or at the very least, a naive racism enabler, and therefore, any concession from the pro-EU side to the anti-EU side was seen as aiding racism. So what ended up happening was that the most extreme views of one team came to influence all debate on the other, pushing it to an equally extreme position. Basically, there could be no concessions under any circumstances to the other team. But that was then, and this, unfortunately, is now.
Every nation in every region now has a decision to make. Either you are with us or you are with the terrorists.
So the Northern Independence Party's Twitter account was temporarily taken down because their tweet in support of patent waivers was mistakenly identified as misinformation. Meanwhile, Jeremy Corbyn has recently come under fire from many of his own supporters for voting against passports and compulsory jabs for NHS workers. Waiving patents would not only speed up production, but also actually allay some of the fears that some people have on the issue. It's actually a cause that we could all be united on against this government. Corbyn, and much of the left of the Labour Party's decision to vote against mandates on NHS staff, was backed by the largest NHS union, Unison, whose position is, Unison supports vaccination in health and social care. The vaccine is safe and we encourage all members who do not have a medical exemption to get their jab, but vaccination should be your decision and the UK government should promote persuasion and reassurance, which would be a reasonable position, except it's clearly a concession to the other team. Similarly, with the government failing to muster a majority on its own benches over the issue of passports, many people suggested Labour could have used the moment to push the government on some more basic preventative measures, like, for example, decent sick pay. The UK is one of the worst in Europe. But this, of course, again, would be a concession to the other side and a betrayal of the team, because it would be an admission that there are other factors at play, and in certain situations they might take precedence.
Didn't expect you back so soon. I'm just doing a bit of reading here. My favourite book, Dangerous Heroes. Corbyn's Ruthless Plot for Power by Tom Bauer. So from what I can tell, looking at the cover of this book, it seems to be about the fact that Labour were dangerous under Corbyn because they were serious about power, But now they're safely under a leadership that clearly doesn't care about that. The problem with this kind of polarizing debate is that it can be used to avoid taking seriously related issues that could unite us. Before the 2016 referendum, there was a growing movement against austerity, a growing consensus around tax reform and financial regulation, and just a general growing understanding around the injustices and failure of our current political order. There was also complete agreement that the NHS needed to be funded more. And then there was Brexit, and only Brexit. But anyway, that was then, and this.
I felt, and I still feel like it is important not to make being concerned about and skeptical around the vaccines to be taboo or restricted, because if you can't examine the evidence, if you can't have an open discussion, that's when conspiracy theories will really take hold, and the assumption will be that. So, I don't know. I definitely think that we should, everyone should be vaccinated, and that's important. But I also think that none of these solutions are actually going to totally work.
With the arrival of the Omicron variant in the UK, both the government and SAGE are in agreement that it is very likely that hospitalisations will rise and the NHS will once again be under severe strain. Yet the government's only response so far has been to advise as many people as possible to get jabbed as quickly as possible. And Labour's response to this advice has been, hey, why does Boris Johnson get to go on TV and speak directly to the nation with no one to hold him to account? Why can't I, Keir Starmer, also get to speak to the public? I want to share my views. I want to be on TV. People deserve to hear both sides. It's not fair. Alright, go on then. I agree entirely with the government. Boris is doing a good job. A great job. Let's all rally around him. Good work. Keep it up. And so, for the people who are already vaccinated, there is not much else to do at this point but turn your anger and frustration towards those who haven't followed suit.
Just a second here. No, I don't have your money here. It's in Bill's house and Fred's house.
Hey, what the hell you doing with my money in your house, Fred?
When really, there is a plethora of things that we should be doing and discussing at this time. Over the past 2 years, the government has made unprecedented demands on the public, telling us not to go to work, not to go to school, to wear masks, to get jabbed, to not travel, to not socialise, to quarantine, to close businesses. Isn't it about time we made some demands on the government? At the beginning of the pandemic, the government offered some financial support that was never adequate and has since been rolled back on. And now, going forward, there are no long-term measures to help anyone. From investment in the NHS and schools to decent sick pay or rent caps or better job security or increased welfare, I'd say a £20 more a week uplift would be a good start. Nothing has been done, and there seems to be no pressure on the government to do anything. Shielding has also fallen by the wayside, while those in government, including Johnson personally, undermine their own messaging and break their own rules. On top of this, old and new crises trundle along amidst the pandemic almost unnoticed. From housing to energy to councils still starved of investment from the austerity cuts, nothing is being done and no solutions are being suggested. These problems are rarely even mentioned. Then of course, there's climate change, where again, the only real decisive messaging is on individuals to recycle more, fly less, do your bit. Again, with no help.
I will always be proud of what was achieved at COP26 in Glasgow and the progress that was made on coal cars, cash and trees. This country and the Prime Minister's leadership on climate change and on nature will make a lasting difference to the whole world.
Meanwhile, in spite of the pandemic, the government continues to quietly carry on as if in default setting, slowly privatising the NHS and bolstering outsourcing firms, while also bringing in new controls on protest and civil disobedience at a time when everyone else's attention is rightly elsewhere. Starmer and his new apprentice Wes Streeting are unwilling to challenge the government on any of the issues I've just mentioned, and so for them, the focus on vaccines is also very convenient. Having no interest in politics, the only criticism they have of this government
is its competence. Boris Johnson's government isn't good enough and must be replaced. The logic here is that if a highly competent Tory government did come in, then Labour would dutifully stand aside at the next election. No, of course not, because it's not a good faith argument. In the minds of people like Wes Streeting, there is no government, real or hypothetical, that could ever be more competent than one led by Keir Starmer, except maybe one led by Wes Streeting.
We live in a strange time. Extraordinary events keep happening that undermine the stability of our world. Yet those in control seem unable to deal with them. And no one has any vision of a different or a better kind of future.
If we really want to envision the enlargement of the state, as occurring along emancipatory lines, which it will never be purely emancipatory, as we know about the state, but far more emancipatory than what we currently have, right? In addressing these issues, and we know that climate change, for example, is connected with the risk of the diffusion of future pandemics and all of this, right? That's going to require, that's going to require this sort of this kind of popular organizing. But what I want to suggest is that, as you say, we all know that it's going in that direction, right? So what I'm saying is that I think that we really need to begin not just selling a left alternative to that, but selling a left alternative to that that's sufficiently radical that it's capable of tapping into the anger that's felt very broadly right now. And look, in the United States, I mean, you've had so many people, who've lost their savings, right? So many people are out of work, so many people who've had their homes foreclosed, right? And we know which demographics have been, affected the worst by this, Black populations, single mothers, sub-proletarian populations and so forth, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, people are really, really mad right now.
Yeah, and
right?
I think
and that's,
I agree with you 100%.
That's obfuscated by the incapacity to easily organize.
In his latest book, Slavoj Žižek connects many of the pre-pandemic mass protests around the world, from Brexit to Gilets Jaunes to Hong Kong, with an understanding of a generalized impunity at the top of our political establishment. An understanding that governments and corporations can't be trusted, and that expert opinion is often weighted in favour of certain economic interests. If one was serious about fighting distrust, one would do very well to start with addressing these concerns. Thank you so much to everyone who subscribed to this channel. If you liked this video, then please leave a like and a comment saying why you liked it. And if you didn't like the video, then leave a comment saying why you didn't. And if you happen to have a bit of spare cash and don't mind parting with it, then maybe consider becoming a patron. Link in description. As it stands, being a patron of this channel gives you absolutely nothing. There's no incentive whatsoever, apart from, I guess, getting your name put on this Ed Miliband stone here. If you have any ideas about what would be a good use for the Patreon channel, then put that in the comments below as well.